The jailhouse stood quiet against the edge of the prairie, its lanterns dim and the night outside humming with crickets and faraway thunder. Inside, Evelyn Hart sat by the ledger desk, copying her father's notes by lamplight, the air thick with ink, metal, and rain waiting to fall. Behind her, the prisoners shifted restlessly, men wrapped in shadows and silence, but one voice carried through the dark, calm and steady as water over stone. "Ma'am," it said, low enough to respect the walls between them. She turned, startled, the quill trembling in her hand. Jonas Hale sat on the far bench, wrists bound, head lifted just enough for the lamplight to catch his eyes, gray, quiet, and impossibly alive. He'd been brought in 2 nights earlier for stealing horses. At least that's what the papers said. But there was something in his stillness that made the accusation feel smaller than the man. "You should be asleep," she said, voice firmer than she felt. He smiled faintly. "Hard to sleep when a man's counting bars." Evelyn closed the ledger. "My father don't like talk from the cells." "Didn't figure he would," he said. "Wasn't talking to him." She wanted to ignore that, to walk back to the house, to be the dutiful daughter of the sheriff she'd always been. But the storm outside pressed harder against the shutters, and something in her refused to leave him alone in that sound. So she asked quietly, "Did you really take them horses?" Jonas's eyes flicked toward the window where lightning flashed white across the room. "I took my brother's blame," he said. "He's got kids. And the law don't care which Hale they hang." The words hung heavy between them. "You'll be tried," she said. He nodded once. "Maybe. Or forgotten." The lamp guttered, the flame leaning low. Evelyn rose, walked to his cell, and set the lantern near the bars so the light fell across his hands. The shackles were too tight, skin rubbed raw where iron met wrist. She hesitated, then fetched a small rag and dipped it in water. "Hold still," she whispered. He did. When she pressed the cloth against the bruised skin, he drew a sharp breath but didn't pull away. "Kindness ain't easy in here," he said softly. "Nor outside," she replied. He looked up, meeting her eyes through the bars. "Then maybe we're both locked up." Thunder rolled, close now, shaking the walls. She set the cloth down, heart racing in a way she couldn't reason with. "Get some rest," she said, stepping back. He smiled just once. "Good night, Miss Hart." She turned toward the door, but before she reached it, lightning flashed again, and she caught her own reflection in the barred window. Her face beside his, 2 people divided by metal and choices. Outside, the first drops of rain hit the roof, each one a promise that the storm would test whatever line they had just crossed. Morning light spilled through the small window above the jail's front desk, washing the iron bars in gold. Evelyn Hart sat straight-backed, pretending to read the day's ledger as her father's boots echoed against the wooden floor. Sheriff Abel Hart was a man carved from habit. Early coffee, clean words. No questions about right or wrong because he'd already decided which side he was on. "You didn't leave the lantern burning all night again, did you?" he asked, setting his hat down. "No, sir," she said quickly, even though the oil's faint warmth still lingered. He grunted and poured water from the basin, scrubbing his hands like he was trying to wash the law itself into his skin. "Hale speak?" "No more than most," she lied, eyes on the ledger. "Good," he said. "Best keep it that way. Man's got a voice that could make mercy sound like sense." She looked up, startled. "You think he's guilty?" "I think he's a man in a cell," the sheriff replied. "That's guilty enough till someone proves different." Evelyn's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him Jonas's story about his brother and the horses, but her father's tone didn't leave room for doubt. Outside, the sound of hammers echoed from the blacksmith's yard, and she could smell breakfast from the boarding house down the street. The world was already moving on, but she couldn't. "You'll be rid of him soon," her father said, tightening his belt. "Marshall's coming from Mesa Ridge to take him Monday." "Monday." The words sank into her like a weight. 3 days. She nodded, forcing calm. "Yes, sir." He studied her face for a long second. The way fathers do when they sense something just beyond reach. "Don't go near that cell alone again," he said finally. "You've got too soft a heart for hard places." She smiled faintly. "I take after you." "Don't flatter me with lies," he muttered, grabbing his hat and stepping out into the rising heat. When the door shut, Evelyn exhaled the breath she'd been holding since dawn. Behind her, a low voice carried from the shadows. "He's not wrong," Jonas said. She turned sharply. "About what?" "You got no place here," he said softly. "You don't belong in a room that smells like rust and regret." She walked closer, crossing her arms. "And where do I belong, Mr. Hale?" He met her gaze evenly, his hands resting on the bars. "Anywhere but on the side that calls mercy a weakness." The words cut through her composure like a whisper too close to truth. "You think you know me?" she said, quieter now. "I don't," he replied. "But I know the look of someone who ain't sleepin' for reasons they can't explain." She stepped closer to the cell, the distance between them narrowing to a breath. "You should save your charm for the judge," she said. "Maybe I already spent it," he murmured. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow drip from the roof gutter outside, each drop marking time neither of them could keep. "The marshal comes Monday," she said finally. "Then you'll be someone else's problem?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe Monday won't come." She frowned. "What's that mean?" "Storm season," he said, eyes flicking toward the window where the horizon darkened again. "You can lock a man in, Miss Hart, but you can't keep the sky from flooding the valley." She didn't answer, but the way his voice carried her name made the air feel heavier. As she turned to leave, he added softly, "You ever decide what side you're on? Make sure it's the one you can live with." His words followed her out the door like a shadow she couldn't close behind her. By the time the sun fell behind the ridge, the sky had turned the color of iron, and the first roll of thunder rattled the window panes like a warning. Evelyn lit the lantern and watched the flame flicker against the walls of the jailhouse, the light trembling the way her hands did. Her father had ridden north that morning with 2 deputies to help evacuate a farm near the river, leaving her to mind the office alone. "Lock up early," he'd said, not knowing the storm he feared wasn't the one on the horizon. By nightfall, rain came hard and fast, drumming on the roof until the gutters overflowed. Water began to crawl under the door, thin at first, then bold. She moved the ledgers and kindling to higher shelves, but the sound of the storm kept rising, an angry, endless roar that felt alive. Behind her, Jonas spoke for the first time in hours. "You should head home, Miss Hart," he said quietly. "Road'll flood soon." "I can't leave you here," she said without thinking, then wished she hadn't. He stood, the chain between his wrists clinking softly. "You care too much for a stranger." "You're not a stranger," she said. Lightning flashed, filling the room with white. For a moment she saw his face clearly, wet hair, shadowed eyes, the shape of someone who'd already been forgotten by the world. Then came the crack of thunder, so close it shook the floor. The roof leaked in 3 places now, and the creak behind the jail sounded closer than it should. "How high does it get?" she asked. "Depends how much mercy the sky's got," he said. Water lapped at her boots. She grabbed a bucket, trying to bail what she could, but it was useless. The storm had decided its course. "Keys are hanging by the desk," Jonas said. "You ought to get to the hill." "I can't," she said, voice low but firm. "My father ain't here," he interrupted gently. "You'll drown waitin' on him." The lamp flickered again, then dimmed. In the half-light, she saw the water already swirling around the legs of his cot. "Chains are iron," he said. "They rust quick." "You're telling me to let you out." "I'm telling you the truth," he said. "But I'll leave it to you to decide what's right." Her heartbeat filled the silence, louder than the rain. She looked at the ring of keys, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Everything in her father's world said no. Law, loyalty, reputation. But everything in her own heart said yes. She stepped toward the desk, hand trembling as she lifted the ring. "If I do this," she whispered, "and you run, then I'll still owe you," he said. "And debts like that don't die easy." She walked to the cell, the water now at her ankles, and slid the key into the lock. The sound of the bolt turning was louder than thunder, heavier than any law she'd ever believed in. Jonas stepped forward slowly, not touching her, just standing close enough for her to see the rain in his eyes. "You sure?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I'm done being sure of the wrong things." She swung the door open. The wind tore through the room, snuffing the lantern out. For a moment, the world was only blackness, rain, and the rush of something irreversible. Then she felt his hand close gently over hers, not to hold, not to claim, but to steady. And together they stepped into the storm. Rain fell so thick it blurred the world into streaks of silver and black. Evelyn held the lantern high as they waded through the rising water behind the jailhouse, her skirts heavy, every breath cold and wet. The sky split again, white lightning carving the valley open. Jonas led her toward the ridge where the ground climbed higher, his chains dragging behind him like a ghost that refused to let go. "Go," she said over the thunder. "You can still make the tree line before dawn." He shook his head. "Not while the river's this high. You'll drown before I do." "You don't owe me," she said. "Don't I?" he answered, glancing back with a faint, incredulous smile. A log crashed downstream, the noise sharp and close. They scrambled up the slope until the jailhouse was a small shape, swallowed by the flood below. From there, she could see the valley glowing faintly under the lightning. The rooftops, the church steeple, the world she'd been raised to protect and obey now half underwater. "You'll freeze," she said, pressing the coat from her shoulders toward him. "Keep it," he said, pushing it back. "Ain't fit for a man who's leavin'." She hesitated, water streaming down her face. "Then where will you go?" "North," he said. "If the river drops by morning, I'll follow the pass to Mesa Ridge. Find proof I didn't steal what they say I did." He stopped, breath unsteady. "You shouldn't have done it." "It was right," she said. "It was mine to do." He stared at her, the rain coursing down his jaw, his eyes darker than the night. "You could hang for this, Evelyn." "So could you," she said, voice trembling. "But I won't let fear be the last thing I serve." He stepped closer, the chain between them clinking once like a heartbeat. "When I come back," he said softly, "I'll come without these." She looked at the man she'd just freed, the outlaw the world would call a criminal, but whose eyes held nothing but gratitude, and felt something rise in her chest she didn't have words for. "You promise?" she asked. "On everything I've got left," he said. "But you'll have to wait." She wanted to tell him she would, that waiting was easier than wondering, but the storm swallowed her words. He reached out and touched her sleeve, just once, light as the rain, and then he was gone, moving down the ridge toward the dark. The lantern sputtered and died, leaving her alone with the sound of the wind and the weight of what she'd done. She turned back toward town, her father's voice echoing in memory. "You've got too soft a heart for hard places." Maybe so, she thought. But a soft heart had just opened a door no law could close. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She stood by the broken fence outside the jail, the cell door hanging open, mud streaked across the floor. The keys lay where she dropped them, half buried in silt, a confession written in silence. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sun broke through the clouds, a weak, pale light that looked like forgiveness if you wanted it to. Evelyn sank to her knees, pressing her palm to the wet earth, whispering into the morning, "Come back." The only answer was the soft clatter of chains carried away by the river. The storm left more than silence behind. It left a town divided between what it had seen and what it pretended not to. When the clouds cleared, the jail stood half-flooded, its doors swollen from rain, and its cells empty. Sheriff Abel Hart returned by noon, boots thick with mud, eyes dark with disbelief. "You left the keys," he said flatly, holding up the rusted ring she had not even tried to hide. Evelyn stood behind the desk, her hands folded to keep them from shaking. "The flood would have killed him," she said. "You think that excuses it?" "No," she whispered, "but I'll live with what it cost." The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, the kind of stare that measured both love and disappointment at once. "You'd best hope he don't come back," he said finally, and left her standing in the ruin of what used to be order. The next days blurred together, mud drying, gossip blooming like weeds. People came by under the pretense of checking the damage, but what they really came for was the story. At the Mercantile, whispers chased her down every aisle. At church, prayers paused when she walked in. Some said she'd fallen for a killer, others that she'd been bewitched. Evelyn stopped correcting them. Words would only feed the fire. She rebuilt the jail alone, scrubbing the floor until the stain of floodwater faded, until it looked like nothing had happened. But every night, when the wind shifted east, she imagined the sound of iron dragging across the earth and wondered if he still wore the chains she'd unlocked. Weeks turned into months. The valley dried, crops came back, and the world resumed its shape as if mercy had never passed through it. Her father spoke little of it now. Silence had become their truce. One evening, as she swept the porch, the stagecoach from Mesa Ridge rolled by, throwing dust over the fence. The driver tipped his hat, and a folded letter fell near her feet. There was no name on the outside, only a piece of chain link tied around the paper like ribbon. Her heart stuttered. Inside, the words were few. "Still walkin'? Still free." The proof takes longer than I thought. No signature, no promise, just the steady handwriting of someone who remembered how softly she spoke his name. She read it until the ink blurred. For the first time in months, she smiled. Not from hope, but from the strange peace that came with knowing he was somewhere under the same sun. She tucked the letter beneath the jail's logbook, the chain still wrapped around it. A secret between the bars and the wind. That night, she lit the lantern and let it burn until morning, its light spilling through the window like a signal across the dark. Some called it madness. Others said she was still waiting. But Evelyn knew waiting wasn't weakness. It was the only way to keep a door open for the kind of man who might return without chains, carrying not apology, but truth. Autumn came with a sharp wind that rattled the shingles and carried the scent of rain that would never quite fall. Evelyn had grown used to quiet. The measured hours between sunrise and dusk, the scratch of her pen across the ledger, the occasional voice at the door. But the stillness broke one evening when her father stepped into the jail with a letter in his hand, and a look that told her the piece was over. "Found this under your logbook," Sheriff Hart said. His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "Looks like a man's handwriting." She froze where she stood. The letter, Jonas's letter, lay open between his fingers, the small piece of chain still looped around it. "You read it?" she asked. "Didn't have to," he said. "The chain said enough." He laid it on the desk. "You've been hiding correspondence with a fugitive." "It's one letter," she said quietly. "He's not a fugitive anymore." "He's a wanted man until I hear otherwise," he said, his tone rising. "You think the law's just a feeling, Evelyn?" She straightened, hands trembling but voice firm. "Maybe it's supposed to be." The silence that followed was heavy as the bars themselves. Her father took a long breath, then pointed to the cell, the one Jonas had left behind. "You know what that is?" "An empty cell," she said. "No," he replied. "That's the hole you dug between right and wrong, and you keep filling it with excuses." His words hit hard because they weren't cruel. They were disappointed. She looked at the cell, its door slightly ajar, the floor still bearing faint water stains from the flood. "He didn't run," she said softly. "He left to prove what you wouldn't believe." "And if he don't come back?" "Then I was still right to open that door," she said. He stared at her, jaw tight. "You sound like your mother," he said finally, "and that's what scares me." He turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Why does it scare you?" He paused at the threshold. "Because good hearts don't last long in this country. The world eats them first." The door shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the room like a verdict. Evelyn stood there for a long time, staring at the cell's open gate. She walked inside, her footsteps soft on the worn boards, and ran her fingers along the cold bars. For the first time, she noticed something etched near the bottom. Letters carved rough and shallow, almost invisible in the dim light. Free or forgotten. Her breath caught. It was his handwriting. She traced the words slowly, her throat tightening. "Not forgotten," she whispered. She pulled the chain from the letter, looped it around one of the bars, and fastened it there, the small metal links catching the last of the afternoon light. It gleamed like a memory made visible. Later, when her father returned from patrol, he found her sitting at the desk, working as if nothing had changed. He didn't ask about the chain, and she didn't explain. But that night, when the lamp burned low, she saw him pause by the cell and touch the metal once before leaving the light on behind him. In that moment, she knew he understood. Maybe not the choice she made, but the kind of love that made it. Winter laid its hand over the valley, soft and merciless. Frost climbed the jailhouse windows, and the river moved slow under a skin of ice, whispering secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Evelyn Hart kept the fire alive with scraps of old ledger pages, the ink curling into smoke as she fed the flames. Her father had taken to silence again, the kind that made every word that did slip through count twice as much. It had been nearly 4 months since the first letter, and she'd stopped expecting another. Until one morning, when the post rider dropped a folded envelope wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of pine. No name, no return, only the same small loop of chain tied around the seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were a few crumpled pages, written in the same slow, deliberate hand she'd memorized long ago. "Evelyn," it began, "the road was longer than I thought. Found the man who sold the horses. He confessed before he died. No court'll care, but I reckon God does. I've been working odd jobs with a preacher near the northern line. Folks here don't ask about chains. They only ask if you can carry what's yours. I carry you. If you ever see snow on the river again, know I made it home that far. There was no signature, only a small smudge at the bottom, ink mixed with blood or rain. She sat down slowly, her breath shaking. He'd cleared his name, but the world was too wide for that to mean safety. Still, the words glowed in her chest like something half-holy. Her father found her there later, the letter still open beside the fire. "He wrote again?" she said before he could ask. "And?" "He's free," she whispered. "But he won't come back." Abel Hart looked at her for a long while, then at the letter. "Some men don't know how," he said quietly. "Freedom's heavier than chains." She turned toward him. "Do you hate him?" "No," he said. "But I hate what the world does to people who mean well." He tossed another log into the fire and watched it spark. If he was innocent, the law'll call him guilty for running anyway. "Then maybe the law's what's broken," she said. He gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's older than both of us." When he left, she picked up the letter again and pressed it against her chest. Outside, snow had begun to fall, gentle as ash, covering the ground where the flood once raged. She walked out onto the porch, letting the flakes melt in her hair. Across the yard, the empty cell window reflected the firelight behind her, bars glowing like threads of gold instead of iron. She thought about the man she'd freed, the promises they'd both broken and kept in their own ways. "If you made it home," she whispered into the snow, "then maybe I did too." The wind carried her words into the dark, and for a moment she swore she heard a chain fall somewhere far off, one final link giving way. She closed her eyes, tears warm against the cold, and smiled the faintest, truest smile she'd ever worn. Not of longing, but of knowing she had already done the bravest thing a person could do. She had set love free, and it had found its own road back to her. The thaw came late that year. Snow melted in slow veins through the fields, leaving behind mud and the soft scent of wet pine. Evelyn stood outside the jailhouse one afternoon, sweeping the porch when a rider approached from the north trail, his coat stiff with frost and his horse breathing clouds into the air. He dismounted with care, nodding politely before unstrapping a canvas bundle from his saddle. "Miss Hart?" he asked. "That's right," she said, resting the broom. "Name's Caleb Reeves. Passed through Mesa Ridge a few weeks back. Met a man there, Jonas Hale." Her heart caught at the sound of it, quiet but certain. "He asked me to deliver something." Caleb unwrapped the bundle, revealing a pair of broken iron shackles, their hinges split clean through. They were lighter than she expected, dulled by weather. The metal worn smooth where wrists once fought against it. "Said they were yours now," the rider added. "Said you'd understand." Evelyn reached out, her hands trembling as she took them. The cold bit into her palms, but she held them anyway, as though they were something holy. "He's alive?" "Was when I left him," Caleb said. "Work in a lumber camp west of the Divide. Man spoke of you like he was still serving a sentence, but one he chose." She smiled faintly, unable to speak. The rider tipped his hat. "Said if I saw you to tell you freedom ain't much use till you got a reason to stay put. Guess he found his." She looked up sharply. "What did he mean by that?" "Didn't say," Caleb replied. "Only that he was building something worth coming back to." He climbed into the saddle again. "Best keep those safe." He said they were the last thing that ever owned him. Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she managed. He smiled and rode off, disappearing into the silver line of trees. She stood there long after the sound of hooves faded, the shackles heavy in her hands. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, catching on the metal until it glowed like gold. She carried them inside and set them on Jonas's old cot. The air felt different. Warmer, lighter, as if something invisible had just been returned. Her father came in not long after, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's that?" "His chains," she said softly. "He sent them back." The sheriff studied them for a long moment. "Most men try to forget what bound him." "Maybe he didn't want to forget," she said. "Maybe he wanted to remember what set him free." Her father looked at her, the hardness in his eyes softening into something near pride. "You kept your word," he said. "You waited." "I didn't wait for him," she said. "I waited for peace." He nodded slowly. "Reckon they might be the same thing sometimes." That night, Evelyn hung the broken chains above the fireplace where the lantern light caught them just right, making them shine like a constellation. Each link told a story. The storm, the door, the silence between them. And as she sat there, watching the fire reflect against the iron, she realized what Jonas had meant. Some people are freed not by running, but by sending back the things that once held them. Spring drifted in like a sigh, soft and slow, painting the hills green again. The flood had long since vanished into memory, but for Evelyn Hart, time had become a circle, every dawn beginning with the creak of the porch, every dusk ending with the glow of the lantern by the window, a silent promise to a man she wasn't sure she'd ever see again. Then, one evening, as the horizon burned copper and the town quieted to a hum, a single rider appeared on the road. He wasn't hurrying. He rode as if the journey itself had already forgiven him. The shape of him came clear as he neared, tall, lean, the kind of posture that belonged to someone who'd carried more than weight for too long. She didn't move at first, just stood there, broom in hand, heart knocking softly against her ribs. When he stopped at the fence, the world seemed to still. "You left the light on," Jonas said, his voice deeper, slower, carrying miles of distance and rain. "I never turned it off," she replied. He smiled, small and unsteady. "Didn't figure you would." He dismounted, boots sinking into the damp earth, eyes sweeping over the jailhouse, the same walls that once held him, now patched and painted. "You kept it standing." "I tried," she said. "It seemed wrong to let it fall." "You always were stubborn." "And you always were late," she countered, but her voice trembled. He laughed once, a sound that felt like the first warm wind after a hard winter. "You got my message?" "All of them," she said, eyes flicking to the broken shackles above the hearth. "You sent them back." "I didn't want to keep what belonged to another life," he said. "But I wanted to see what you did with it." "I hung them," she said. "Thought maybe they'd remind me what mercy costs." He stepped closer, the distance between them closing like a door that had waited too long to be opened. "And what did it cost?" he asked. She met his gaze and answered, "Everything I was before I opened that cell." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind lifted strands of her hair. His hand twitched like he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. "The law clear your name?" she asked. "The man who framed me died with the truth still in his throat," he said quietly. "The rest don't matter much." "It matters to me," she whispered. "Then maybe that's enough." He looked at her then, really looked, and whatever years or miles stood between them fell away. "I told you I'd come back without chains," he said. "You did." "And now?" he asked, voice low. "What happens now?" She smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Now you stay a while," she said. "There's a roof needs mending and a stove that doesn't listen." He chuckled, the sound easing into the air like an old song remembered. "Guess I'll earn my keep." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You already did." The sun dipped behind the ridge, turning the sky the color of forgiveness. Jonas took off his hat, not out of habit but reverence, and together they walked up the steps toward the door she'd never locked again. Inside, the lantern flickered to life, the chains glinting above the fire like stars that had finally found their way home. Morning came soft, gold, and forgiving, the kind of morning that made even the wind sound grateful. Evelyn woke to the quiet scrape of boots outside and the smell of coffee drifting in from the porch. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. But then she heard Jonas humming low, steady, the tune rough but warm like everything about him. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him mend the fence post by the gate. The sun caught on the hammer in his hand, on the scar at his wrist where the shackle had once bitten deep. Freedom looked strange on him, but it fit. "You're early," she said. "Old habits," he replied without turning. "Men who've known walls tend to wake before light." "And when the light finally comes?" He smiled faintly. "Then you stop running from it." She walked toward him, her bare feet brushing the cool boards of the porch, the same boards she'd swept through every season of waiting. "You plan on staying?" she asked. He paused, leaned against the fence. "I plan on not leaving," he said. "There's a difference?" "Big one." He met her eyes. "Leavin' means looking back. Stayin' means buildin'." For a while they said nothing, just listened to the creak down the hill, the song of a sparrow perched on the roof beam. "You still think about the day you opened that door?" he asked finally. She nodded. "Every time the rain starts." "And do you regret it?" She shook her head slowly. "No, the world might have, but I never did." He studied her, the quiet reverence in his face deeper than any words. "Then maybe we both served our sentence," he said. "And this is what comes after." He set the hammer down and unlatched the gate, letting it swing open wide toward the road. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Leaving it open," he said, "in case someone else ever needs a way through." She smiled, tears glinting in the corner of her eyes. "That's a dangerous kind of mercy." "Maybe," he said, stepping beside her. "But it's the only kind that lasts." The wind carried through the open gate, stirring the tall grass until it sounded like applause. Evelyn reached for his hand, not out of need, but out of gratitude, and he took it gently, the same way he had when the world was ending in rain. Together they stood there, two people who had learned that love wasn't about holding on, but knowing when not to close the door. Inside, the fire crackled, the broken chains above it glowing red in the morning light. She looked up at them one last time, then turned to Jonas and whispered, "You ever wonder if God keeps a key for every lock we break?" He smiled. "Reckon he keeps the ones we open for someone else?" She laughed softly, leaned her head against his shoulder, and watched the sun climb higher. For the first time in years, the jailhouse didn't look like a place of punishment. It looked like a home where mercy had learned to live. The gate stayed open, creaking gently in the wind, not as an invitation, but as a reminder that some doors, once opened by love, are never meant to be closed again. When she looked at those chains glowing in the firelight, she realized freedom wasn't something he gave her. It was what they'd both built by forgiving what broke them. If you were Evelyn, would you have opened that cell or waited for the storm to choose for you? Tell us in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West.